So thanks again to PhotoWings for sponsoring these events and for their support on this. We've got a good number of people with us this evening. So again, my name is Finbarr O'Reilly. I'm a photographer with 7 Photo, and I'm here with Nicolò Filippo Rosso, another independent photographer. And both of us separately traveled this year to Eastern Chad to document the refugee crisis from the conflict in Sudan. Just for a bit of background on that situation, the war in Sudan has been going on since mid-April of last year, 2023, when 2 rival generals started fighting for power in the country, and it has split Africa's 3rd largest country into areas controlled by the government forces, the Sudanese Armed Forces, and a paramilitary force, the Rapid Support Forces, which controls much of Darfur, and they've been also battling for the capital, Khartoum. And this has kind of laid waste to cities, health centers, clinics. It's destroyed agriculture, farming, and disrupted life across this vast country. And it has resulted in 13 million people being displaced within the country and spilling across borders into neighboring countries, which is the biggest displacement crisis in the world. At the same time, half of the country's 50 million people are also facing the worst hunger crisis that the world has seen since the Ethiopian famine of the 1980s. So this is a massive scale of humanitarian crisis in terms of the hunger crisis, the displacement crisis, and the number of people affected. The number of people who may have died from the conflict is unclear. It could be anywhere as low as 15,000 people, but some American officials have estimated that it could be up to 150,000 people. So these are extreme numbers, an extreme situation. And of those 13 million people who are displaced, nearly 1 million, about 900,000 or a little more, are in just across the border, western border of Sudan, in Eastern Chad. And it's in a number of camps dotted along the border of Eastern Chad and Darfur, the westernmost province of Sudan, where both Nicolò and myself focused our work earlier this year. Documenting the situation in these camps. The situation is that a lot of the people who were subject to attacks over the last year, most of which happened in 2023, fled towns and cities like El Geneina, which is only 20 minutes to half an hour across the border from Eastern Chad. So many people fled attacks that took place last year, but now the majority of people tend to be fleeing from the lack of food and trying to get food at the refugee camps, some of which are organized and looked after by humanitarian organizations like World Food Program, UNHCR, and other NGOs like Doctors Without Borders. And it's in that context that we were working. We were going into the clinics run by Doctors Without Borders. We were moving through the camps. And when, Nicolò, when was the first time you went there? I think it was a little bit earlier than me. I was there at the end of July.
I was there, I arrived around the 10th in Adre of June.
Okay.
Then I worked for around a week, and then I went back to the capital and eventually went back to the border again for some more time.
So you were working in sub-Saharan Africa for the first time on this assignment, is that right?
Yeah, exactly.
So what were your initial impressions compared to the work that you've done in other parts of the world? What was, I lived and worked in West and Central Africa for 15 years, so I can talk a
Yeah.
little bit about that later, but I'd be interested to know from your perspective, working in that region for the first time, how did the situation strike you compared to other maybe displacement or hunger crises that you may have covered elsewhere before?
Yeah. Well, like Venezuelan migration during the time I was like constantly documenting it was about 6 million people who had fled Venezuela, and uh, and so the numbers are very high as well. But still, across the Americas, there are no refugee camps, which is it's a characteristic of the migration across that continent. Like there is, like there are conditions of like vulnerability, precarity, poverty, endemic violence that apply to all the countries from Mexico, but even in North America. There is a cycle of poverty and violence in most of the countries people are fleeing from. So people were leaving Venezuela, going to Colombia, and Colombia was failing them as Venezuela in many cases. So they were forced to continue to move, but still they could do it, like hitchhiking, walking on the streets, because there are infrastructure. The remoteness of Eastern Chad, it was the first time for me that I saw something like that, and also the magnitude of these camps. We're talking about Adres, now it's almost 300,000 people. Abu Tenge is 50,000, I guess. Abeche, Meche, sorry, 50,000 or 45,000. But the magnitude of the landscape is striking.
Would you mind maybe
And
sharing some of the images while you're describing
yeah,
this
of
to give
course,
to
of
give the
course.
viewers a sense of what you were seeing when you arrived there in June, and so they can see this landscape and these camps that you're describing there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
are you seeing the pictures?
Yes, it's not quite full screen, but I think it's okay.
Okay.
So it's quite dry and dusty, which is different from when I was there during the rainy season. It looks very different.
Yeah. Maybe this is full screen.
Maybe, yeah, maybe.
Yeah. Also, like it's very diverse. Light changes all the time, and I've noticed also looking at your pictures. Like you were there when I had already left, I guess, and planning to return, but then got malaria and had to stop for some
Right.
time. But I
You,
noticed,
you, got,
like
you got
that.
malaria on your first trip to Sub-Saharan.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. This is one of the first images I made,
I know exactly
and I
where that is,
was
right under the bridge, right? The bridge that doesn't
yeah,
really.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And so this was one of my really first impression of what I was about to document.
Right. So just
And
for
we have sorry, go
no,
ahead.
no, just for people looking at this image, there's a bridge right on the border between Sudan and Eastern Chad, and it's a concrete bridge that was built over a kind of a wadi, a river that gets flooded and is dry much of the year. But the bridge doesn't actually go anywhere because there's no road on either side of it, so it's just a structure. But people gather under it for shade, or if it's raining, for shelter. And so
Yeah,
these Chadian and Sudanese, probably just Chadian officials here, right, registering people
yeah,
coming.
yeah. They are registering. Yeah,
Yeah, so they're registered. So this is right on the border.
yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
And
Yes,
this is
Karen.
during one of those, like sandstorm and like when I work in the Americas, it's so many years. I feel I've been part of that movement of people because I've been traveling a lot with the asylum seeker migrants from many countries. And when I arrived in Chad, that was completely different for me. Like it's a new continent. It's a place where also, like I don't have the knowledge that I have gathered during the years documenting another migration crisis. So while I feel that while documenting in the Americas, like over there I could reach some depth in the observation of the situation because of my commitment, but also the way I was involved with the people, you know. Here, my first impression has been very, very graphic, you know, also because the communication is more difficult with people. You know, I am studying Arabic and I speak a little bit, but it's still not enough to really engage with people. So also the distance from the situation, but you know, it changed the way I observed everything, you know. So and I was quite lucky because I worked first with the UNHCR and then with WHO, and they sort of gave me a list of, you know, like the main topics they wanted to be covered, and they give me quite carte blanche, you know, like I needed that I had to produce certain type of images for specific needs, but in general I was let free to, you know, I just explore the situation. And during the first assignment with UNHCR, that mission was joined between the European Commission Agency for Humanitarian, which is ECHO, and UNHCR in response of the lack of attention by international media to the crisis. So basically, they invited journalists from different countries in Europe, and they offered the logistic to
Right.
to document the situation. So I was the photographer with UNHCR, but during those days I was also with other journalists, and you know, like I know sometimes NGO international agencies do that, but honestly, I felt it was so important that they also do that kind of give that kind of support to journalists, you know, because when an editor doesn't have enough budget to send you for a story and you still feel it's important, that was great that some of those, you know, like journalists could eventually publish the work. So I was also helping them because, you know, like I was producing content for you know, like for UNHCR specifically, but then I was also photographing people that other journalists were interviewing in order to help them illustrating their report.
Right, and so there are a couple of questions from people watching now about how you know how you know you know somebody's deleted their question now, but yeah, Lucas was asking about which NGOs and so on you were working with. So you've talked a little bit about that, and a little bit about the brief you had from your client and how you strategized your approach. But I think you've touched on that a little bit as well. And ultimately, your work was published in Time magazine, correct?
Yeah, the work was published first on Time magazine. I can also, you know, this is the publication. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yeah. So I produced, so the work was done. I also worked a few days on my own, but mainly was produced for UNHCR at the beginning, and probably also in response to what some of the participant was maybe asking. I got that job because I have been working regularly with UNHCR since 2020. So I mainly go on missions that are already, you know, planned by them. But in certain occasion, you know, like I've been also able to pitch stories or to let them know that I was documenting a situation. So I already knew when I got this assignment that I would have overstayed. So after the assignment was done, I had to go back to the capital to, you know, like extend my visa and permission to work at the border by the authority. This is another thing that is very different, you know, from what I'm used to. In Latin America, I cross border even with asylum seekers, you know, or either I cross the border legally, get it stamped, go back to the other country legally, so then I can cross with migrants, and very, very easily, you know. And there is a level of violence which is constant across the Americas, but still it's the borders are completely porous, you know. It's easy to move from a place to the other, and potentially you can do it with a touristic visa as well. Chad is another thing, you know, like you need permissions
Permissions,
So
permissions, and permissions, and permissions. Yeah. So
exactly, it's
that's
several layers of permissions, and I spent 1.5 months in Chad, and I probably worked 9 days shooting pictures. Um, because like sometimes also the logistics, it's impossible to go to a place because it's raining, or it's impossible to get on a flight because there are just 2 flights a week to reach the border, and they are humanitarian flight. So it's very different because like when I get into some sort of when like there are many ways to also um, be welcome into a family's intimacy, like a couple, a person, somebody's story. And in Latin America, I do that just by talking to people and like dealing with that. And this was very, very different. So instead of being driven by the, like these levels of relationship that you can establish with people elsewhere, I was led mainly by like my first very impressions of this place that was very magical to me. Also, like I mainly work in black and white, and when I saw like all the nuances of this place and the color, like I was concerned because I wanted to like also somehow honor, like the diversity of the color, and like they talk a lot about the soul of a people as well, and but at the same time, I didn't want the colors to distract. So I work with somebody, Valentino Bellini, who's a photographer, but he's also a post producer, and we tried, like to sort of honor the color without having the color. Like imposing its presence on the picture. But this is because like coming from black and white, in general, I see colors as a distraction.
Mhm.
You know,
That's interesting
so
because I work a lot in color, and
yeah,
for me, this is in a place like this. As you can see, even from your more desaturated photos, the color that you encounter, the clothing that people are wearing, is very compelling, very visual. What was your impression of the people who you met? Were there any particular experiences that stuck with you
yes,
in terms of encounters you had, and the way that people who had fled extreme circumstances in Sudan, and were now adapting to life in a displaced and refugee camp? What were those
yeah.
interactions like, and what kind of impression did you have of the people, the Darfuri people who you met?
Like also for like our colleagues here today, Darfur is as big as Texas, is as big as mainland Spain. So it's really a huge, like a huge part of a big part of Sudan, and also the conflict has been rooted in a conflict for the land. Like there are like indigenous African communities, the Zagawa, the Mazalit, the Fur, which are sedentary, and then there are the Arabs who are nomads, and they were used to move from north to south, and when season of drought recurred repeatedly, they started to try to go to south where the indigenous African communities live, and like and the conflict for the land started, and still it seems, talking to many people, that that's the main reason for the conflict. And I stopped on this picture because one day I heard that somebody was getting married the day after, and I was invited to photograph. Like, and I also ensured them that they would have had some of the photographs that I was doing, and people were dancing, there were music, people were extremely open, and like. celebrating the wedding. Thing is that in this photo, this is the best man, you know, and the man who was getting married the broom, thank you, the broom was celebrating without the bride, because the bride was in Al-Fashir, which is another city in Darfur, which is now besieged by the rapid support forces, and she cannot she cannot leave the city. So these people we are seeing in the picture now, they were from Al Janina, right? Because from Al Janina, many people left and just walk across the border and enter Chad, and since last year started to sort of like build a day-to-day life in the camps. They decided to keep the date of the marriage, so they were celebrating, but separately, and I found that it was extremely beautiful and extremely sad in the same time, because you're celebrating for something that you hope to leave, one day, but it's very uncertain. And actually, I'm still in touch with the broom, and he's still waiting to see his wife, and now 3 months passed. So this was one of the stories that touched me. But you also see, like this is right at the border, and these are Darfuri villages. So these places are now occupied by the RSF forces. So people who had fled Darfur are now, of course, they are living in different areas of the borders, but at the arrival, they can see their hometown, and that is now occupied. And of course, okay, I was about to say that we see a lot of women and children all the time in these photographs. There are men, of course, as well, and I see some sort of organization, like the WFP program is that they give food every month in each camp, and so they are constantly distributing food. And in this picture, I think I saw something similar. So you probably have seen something like that. So they build sort of piles that are calculated to be the minimum caloric intake for 25 persons. So then they distribute that this way, and people very meticulously are organizing themselves for the distribution. So women in general do that. And so I was surprised to see that it was quite organized. In the same time, like these are sorghum, palm oil, salt, soap, like very, very basic goods to survive.
And it's
And
worth
I was shocked.
pointing out too, as well, is that the response has been very limited, right, compared to the scale of the crisis. So
Yeah.
I think the UN has said they've only got about 12 or 15% of what they need to cater to the number of people who have taken up places in these camps. And this food distribution is every month, kind of, when the WFP doesn't have the material, or if the roads are washed out, or rains have been heavy, like when I was there, the distribution gets delayed. And there were some people who hadn't received any food distribution in 3 months. So it's quite a complex issue, and this area actually functions fairly well because there has been a presence of refugees from Darfur in Sudan for over 20 years, because there was a previous crisis like this that I covered in 2008, a very similar situation, and it's still ongoing now. And part of this issue around that you mentioned, the lack of coverage, is tied to this lack of response as well. The international humanitarian response has been preoccupied by these other conflicts in Ukraine and in the Middle East that are tying up a lot of the resources for
Yeah, exactly.
aid, and also for media coverage as well, really.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting to think about why some of that is. This is a recurring theme with major conflicts across the African continent that may affect far greater numbers of people than in, say, Ukraine or in countries in the Middle East. And yet a crisis of this scale isn't getting the kind of daily updates of news stories, the daily updates of political responses, and anything like that, like we see from when I'm covering Ukraine for the first 2 years. I'm on assignments there regularly for the New York Times, and for many years, for the first 2 years, we were having constant daily rolling updates of everything that was happening. We see the same now from Gaza, from Israel, from Lebanon, constant rolling updates from the conflict unfolding there. But we don't see that from this conflict, even though the scale and the numbers of people affected is absolutely staggering, and in many ways dwarf the conflicts in Ukraine and in the Middle East. So there's something that's interesting there. All the major media have covered this war in Sudan in some capacity, but not to the same extent. And the stories that I wrote, one of them for the Washington Post was about why that is. As photographers, what compels us to take pictures of situations like this that, for the most part, it seems doesn't really change anything. I'm going back and photographing the same scenes that I photographed there 20 years ago, exactly the same scenes. So what becomes the point of doing this when nothing seems to change? And I know from my perspective, it's that I go in with the understanding that it's unlikely. I mean, it's unlikely that any single photograph or story shifts the course of these kinds of conflicts or history in any way. But I think having people such as yourself and other journalists going, we individually contribute to a steady flow of information that hopefully over time informs people and decision makers ultimately. But it is pretty striking the lack of attention that this has got, both from the media and from the political side, whether it's the U.S. And we know that the United Arab Emirates have supported the Rapid Support Forces with weapons and logistics. And the Rapid Support Forces have been widely accused by many human rights organizations and Western governments of carrying out massacres and ethnic cleansing of the very people that we're seeing, the very communities that we're seeing in your pictures here. So, if the U.S. did want to put more pressure on the UAE to stop supporting this war, they potentially could, but that hasn't happened. And maybe that's partly because there isn't the kind of media coverage or scrutiny of the situation there that we see in other places.
Well, you're touching some important points here.
Yeah, I know it's tricky, right? And it comes down to this concept of, and this is what I wrote about in my story for my op-ed for the Washington Post from Eastern Chad, was this idea about necropolitics. This notion that assigns differential value to human life. And essentially that the farther away people are from the axes of privilege and of power, the less value their lives are deemed to have.
Exactly, and it's normalized, and it's
this just means that Africa's largely ignored wars remain trapped in this constantly self-reinforcing cycle where they don't end because there's not enough coverage, there's not enough attention, there's not enough response, there's not enough political will and pressure to change things on the ground.
Well, it's it seems that if people had actually a different value, but it's very recent also in Italy, they are trying to deport migrants and asylum seekers from Italy to Albania, which is the first impression when I heard that that was going to happen, it was like, okay, they are taking B people in a B place, and that's their mentality. So I think that the reason why there is a lack of attention on Africa is also because Europe is still using it a lot. You know, like we're like. You said, you know, like why we're still doing this, because, you know, nothing is going to change. But yeah, it's exactly, we sort of we build small pieces, you know, and together we try to leave a memory of something that is going on now and that will possibly help explain in the future, or even if it's just a way for us to, you know, like graphically approach all this complexity and try to understand it then through the picture that what we are witnessing now. And then I think you've been for many more years working in the field and in several countries in Africa. But the new frontier they see in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Sudan is that, you know, the new frontier of the conflict is that we cannot document the conflict. You know, and if we want to document the conflict, the media's panorama is it's very, I mean, it's very weak, you know, to take decisions.
But this is also how powers control information, right? So it's very difficult, next to impossible, to cover the war, Ukrainian war, from the Russian side. And Israelis, Gazan photographers in Gaza and journalists in Gaza have done an incredible job of covering the conflict in Gaza, but no foreign journalists have been able to come in and provide any relief or support for those journalists who've done an unbelievable job in the most extremely dangerous conditions perhaps ever for journalists covering a conflict. But I suppose, you know, my feeling about this is that, yes, you know, none of our pictures will change anything, and maybe in the end, photographs only serve to remind us of what happened. But I still do feel that, you know, if we've done our job, and the image carries empathy and concern, and then really it's up to those who wield the real power to do their jobs. But I'm going to go to a couple of questions here because they're coming in into the chat box. And I think the first one is a really important one from Irene Amodei, or Irene Amodei. And Irene asks, could we share how we manage consent ethically in these contexts? And I'd be very happy to do that, because I think it's possibly one of the most important things when it comes to the power dynamic between a Western photographer working in an environment like this with people who are very vulnerable, people who are exposed and need to maintain their dignity and agency in the interactions that they have with us. And one of the things that certainly was interesting for me is, this isn't always the case in the places where I work, but certainly for the 20 years or so that I've covered conflicts in Darfur, Sudan, and then the refugee crisis in Eastern Chad with Darfuri Sudanese refugees, is their incredible level of openness and willingness to share their stories. They really want to share their stories, to the point where I had to kind of really brace myself every time I met somebody, because they were so willing and wanting to tell me often quite horrific stories of attacks, targeted ethnic attacks, of sexual violence, and all of the things that go with that. So in terms of getting consent, it was quite easy in this context. But maybe I'll just share some images of one particular story, one particular sequence that I did. And that might illustrate a little bit about how that worked for me. And let me try. Let me see if I can do this entire screen. Can you tell me whether these are coming up for you as the entire screen? Is it?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is a morning that I spent photographing in a clinic for Doctors Without Borders. And obviously, in any medical setting, you do need to have the consent of the patients and obviously the doctors, who had, the administrators first, and then the doctors who allowed me to work in there. But of course, the agreement is that for any patients who I wish to photograph, I do need to get their consent. So I was hanging out at this clinic in the admissions area when this mother and daughter came in. The mother was helping her daughter, who could barely walk, in, and she was admitted, and she was kind of diagnosed. The mother's in pink. The daughter's name is Naimat Ahmed, and the mother's name is Khadija Abdullah. And I had a translator and local producer who herself was from Darfur and also lived in the refugee camp. So she was my kind of the person who could connect with anybody who I wanted to photograph and speak with them and get the consent I needed. So at the appropriate moment, in a lull in the admissions process, she went over to Khadija Abdullah and explained who I was, what I was doing, and asked whether it would be okay for me to document this process. And Khadija gave us that permission. And so I spent the next couple of hours documenting the physicians and medical staff treating her daughter. She was diagnosed with diphtheria and abscess in her throat. And I continued to photograph and the interactions between the mother and daughter. As the daughter was then treated and was looking like she would need to spend, once they diagnosed her with diphtheria, they realized they had to isolate her, so they took her to an isolation tent where she was admitted. And then I continued to photograph in other parts of the clinic, and I was in the therapeutic feeding centers because there were a lot of malnourished children. And I finished my day, and I felt that these images of Naimat being treated were reasonably strong. I went home, and then the next morning I returned to the clinic to continue my work, and I inquired about Naimat to see how she was doing. And at that point, I was told that she had died overnight. And then I suddenly thought, oh, well, this is obviously a very sad situation for the family, for the mother. And so I then felt it was not, even though I had consent from the mom to do these photographs, I didn't feel it was appropriate for me to publish them without then trying to get further consent from her and from the family, given that the context of these images had now changed. So what I then had to do was try and find her in a camp of 200,000 refugees, which proved a little bit difficult because we seem to remember an area that we thought she had lived in. But when we spent about an hour or so driving around, asking people if they'd heard of anything about a death of a child in the area, nobody had. So we went back to the clinic and asked around different places and eventually got the name of another neighborhood, drove around there for another hour and a half, kind of asking people, and eventually stumbled on somebody who had heard something and was going to go to the condolence of the family. So we traveled with them in my vehicle to that location, and I found the mother and spent some time with her at the compound, the little her straw hut. And she mentioned that she welcomed me. She remembered me from the day before. She was obviously very upset and distressed. She had 9 other children. Her husband was still in Darfur, but she welcomed me into the compound, and I sat with them. I talked with them. She said they were going to the grave a little later in the day and asked whether I could accompany them, and they agreed. And so I took some photographs of Khadija as she prayed over the grave of her daughter who had died the night before. I then found out that they were going to have this is Naimat's mother again at their compound. They then said they were going to have a mourning ceremony in a couple of days and a morning feast to honor Naimat and the other siblings, the 9 other siblings and other women. All members of the community came together. Everybody contributed a little something to buy some food to prepare. And I went back every day and spoke with the family, spent about an hour or so with them, drinking some tea, talking with them, listening to stories about Naimat, including from her sister, Fardus, who's the one in the center here in red. And they invited me to come back for the feast a couple of days later. I also decided at this point that it was appropriate for me to contribute a little something, as everybody else from the community had done, to the cost of the meal. So I gave them a few dollars as well, or a few of the local currency, not out of payment for the access or anything, but out of respect
Of
for
course.
the situation. It was not asked or expected, but I felt it was appropriate under the circumstances. And I'm still, Fardus is the sister is in the red there, and they're bringing the food to the men who are sitting in the next little compound, the men and women eating separately. I'm still in touch with her on WhatsApp regularly,
Amazing.
but and I just do it through a translation because she only speaks Arabic, so I have to translate. But this was the scene at their compound, right? But all of this is to say that for me, consent and informed consent, and I've sent them the articles, I've sent the family through Fardus, I've sent them the images, so that they're difficult for them, of course, but they really wanted the story told. The feeling was that they want the world to know what happened to their daughter. So in the hope that it wouldn't happen again. Of course it will. And in fact, a couple of days later, I photographed the death of another child in another clinic. I'll just show you some of those images, perhaps. Yeah, entire screen. And these were, again, from another clinic from Doctors Without Borders. And again, I was documenting in a clinic where it was an intensive care unit, and this young boy had been admitted, and the doctors were trying to treat him as he went into septic shock. This is his father on the left, who is watching, and this is the father who's holding his foot as the boy was taking his last breaths. In this situation, I had the consent of the father. I'd taken some pictures before this, and I had the consent, obviously, of the doctors. But again, once the child passed away in this situation, a few moments after these pictures were taken, I had to wait for the situation to unfold, as the doctors informed him that the boy had died. And I followed him as they took the body to the morgue, and as the father grieved over the son's body. And then, I waited for some time for the father to, absorb some of what had just happened. And then I had my local producer speak with him and ask whether it was okay for us to use the photos. Very difficult situation, and I know also for Doctors Without Borders, it raised questions for them around consent and patient dignity and so on. And my partner actually works for Doctors Without Borders, and for her as a medical person, she doesn't feel that these images are appropriate, but in a journalistic sense, they are, because they're telling a story, they're showing a reality. There are things that are I think important to show. Those are the most extreme examples of when consent is necessary. But of course, any interaction where you're photographing people, I have a series of photos from their portraits as well of survivors of ethnically targeted attacks on the Masalit community, people who suffered amputations, gunshot wounds, survivors of sexual violence as well, all of whom, in those situations, you have to provide all of the appropriate means of them to consent, and also to have agency during those conversations, so that they know that they only tell you what they want to tell you. You're not pressing them. They have the power to stop the conversation anytime they want. I don't ask probing questions. I just ask what they are interested in sharing with me. And then in the crowd groups, it's a little different, right? So when you're covering food distribution in situations that you also showed, like these, it's hang on, let me share these with you as well. Share screen, entire screen. Right. So in these situations, you can't go and ask every single person in the pictures for consent, but you do have a sense when you're there, right, Nicolò, that if people are comfortable being photographed or not, how they respond to you as a guy with a camera, a foreigner with a camera.
Yeah, of course.
Very quickly, you see how how people are reacting to your presence. If people don't like it, or if they're turning away, or if they're covering their faces, it's a very different feeling than when somebody is just accepting of your presence, or you acknowledge them with a nod or a hello or a greeting. and
I actually was wondering, how is that possible that so much brutality is going on in a place where such nice people, live? You always feel connected, like I felt connected instantly to the Sudanese people there. It was very easy to engage, and even with the language barrier, I was also working with somebody who was helping me and translating, but even without that, it's you're immediately connected. And like you were talking about how much of the operations of the international agencies are unfunded, and I mean, I couldn't understand that. And talking to a few people who work in NGOs or in this big other agency, they actually told me that they've received more money, than previous year. But the magnitude of the so many conflicts around the globe makes it impossible for them to act and mitigate all of them. And so like it's and the operation now at the border, for example, in Adre, is to try to move all these people more inland, because you have mentioned that there is sexual violence used as like weapon of war in Darfur, but that happens as well inside the refugee camps. There are bandits, even like independent and smaller groups of bandits who raid girls and children during the night. So the operation will be to try to move these almost 300,000 people that are now in Adre in smaller places inside, but these people, they don't want to go because they are waiting for the conflict to end. They are full of hope somehow that the conflict will end, and they want to go back to Darfur. So they want to stay there because it's closer, In the same time, it makes the day-to-day life much more precarious and and violent as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge for the aid organizations that want to move people away from Adre and from that border is that the places where they want to move them to the organized camps run by the UNHCR is that they're in quite remote locations, whereas Adre is a big trading hub and always has been. So they can find little jobs, they can have little sales and trade at the market. It's also right by the border, so they can go back and forth across the border. They can visit Jenaina if they need to, if they feel it's safe enough to do that. And a lot of people do cross back into Darfur, and then they return to Eastern Chad when the food distribution happens. Then they return to Darfur with the food from the distribution. They're not supposed to. It's not how it's supposed to work, but that's how it goes, right? So
and that explains also the relationship of the current conflict with the conflict that you probably covered 20 years ago. Because they are interconnected, and there are many people who had previously left Darfur who are now living in Chad, and
and so there are a couple more questions I wanted to get to because we only have about 10 minutes left.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a question about difficulty in photographing women in Chad. This is Lucas who said that he struggled photographing women in Chad. I think that may be quite different. Even though we were in Chad, we were photographing Sudanese, and more specifically, we were photographing Sudanese from Darfur, so Darfuris, and there's a real openness to photographers and to journalists, certainly among the Darfuris that I've met over the 20 years that I've documented people in Darfur and Darfuris in Eastern Chad. Never ever had any issues around that whatsoever. Chad, perhaps slightly different sensibilities culturally. And then you also asked Lucas about how Nicolò had worked for 9 days out of 1.5 months in Chad, and that this was rather an exception because from a business perspective, it's not really viable to do that longer term, right? To only work 9 days out of 45. But yeah, I think that's not the ideal scenario. I was lucky.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I managed to arrange all my permits remotely before I traveled there. So I had everything lined up, and I picked it up as I landed, and I had a good local producers in N'Djamena, and I landed on a Sunday night, and Monday morning I was flying, and then, by Monday morning I was in Adre working already in the afternoon. So it was smooth in the sense that I had all the right permits, and I had been well informed by people, and I'm used to working in these places, so I know there's like all these layers of these kinds of things to do. Randy asked something about impartiality. I'm not sure I quite understand the question. Exhaustion, ability to act. I'm sorry, I don't quite understand your question there, Randy, but if you want to reframe it, I'll try to answer it more clearly. Nicolò, you said you're thinking of going back soon, right? To continue working.
Yeah. I mean, like I was there at the beginning for UNHCR. So I also started working very quickly, but then when I decided to stay longer after the official mission of the UN, I had to do new documents to work on my own, and that was what took some time. And then I let the editors I work with know that I was there, and they started to receive more assignments. So I went back to the border, and also from the border it's very hard to file. So after the first assignment, I went back to N'Djamena, and I worked from the UN headquarters. So I had connection, and I could file the photo, do the post-production, captioning, etc. So that was also quite useful. And after that, I worked. It was a little bit than 9 days. Probably the second assignment was 8 days, so I probably worked 12, 13 days in total, but still it's of course very hard. And then I got COVID, malaria, pneumonia all at once, and I did a medical evacuation, and I went back to N'Djamena. So I had a few assignments that I lost, and others where the editors or the NGO were quite flexible, so they told me that we could have rescheduled them. So then when I was back to Europe, we resumed the conversation, and now I'm going back to work on assignment and to continue to work on my own after the assignment is done, and to continue to syndicate. Because of course the media landscape is not paying too much attention to Chad, but at the same time, it's our effort also to go back to places and continue to insist in the exploration of a place, that then through also the channels to distribute the work that we have, little by little creates a sort of landscape of the conflict through the eyes of those who flee it, because it's still impossible to enter, almost impossible to enter to RSF-controlled Darfur.
There's a question from Kate Manzo, who teaches a university course on humanitarian work and was looking at images of Chad refugee camps last week, and she was asking about the lack of media attention due to the fact that, is it stereotypical images of starving children in Yemen and elsewhere are more saleable? I think maybe, Kate, we might have answered that a little bit earlier in when we were talking about necropolitics, but I'm just going to put into the chat group, the webinar chat, a link to the Washington Post story that I published that might give you a few more answers on that issue in terms of media coverage and so on. I'll leave that link there for anybody who wants to see it. Alessandro Stefanelli asks, can photojournalists and documentary photographers influence media agenda setting to create more space for overlooked stories that lack the visibility they deserve, in your opinion? Well, I mean, certainly we hope to. That's why both of us went there. We went because we felt the story deserved to be covered. And as Nicolò said, it's very difficult to access Darfur. So the only way to kind of tell stories from there is through the refugee camps and the witness testimony that people who have now crossed the border into Eastern Chad or other countries can provide. And despite all the permits that we had to get, actually, the working environment in Eastern Chad is very permissive. It's very easy to work. There are no hotels or anything, and it's fairly basic. But we stayed in compounds belonging to NGOs like World Food Program or Medical Doctors Without Borders. They all have little guest houses where their staff stay, and where journalists also can rent a room and pay for a bit of food. So certainly we try to do that. There's a question from Rufai Ali. According to friends and family in Sudan conflict area, it is more dangerous to carry a camera than a machine gun. The question is, was there any obstacles that we face in Chad? And in our opinion, how is it possible to document conflict areas? So yeah, I mean, we didn't have any obstacles. It was very easy, as I just said, to work in Eastern Chad generally, apart from some of the permissions you have to get. It's just paperwork, bureaucracy. And it can be done, but no, it's very low risk where we were working. It's not an active conflict zone at all, even though the conflict is just across the border. There was no risk carrying cameras there. Yes, there are some cases of banditry. There was one death in the camp overnight while I was there. On one of the roads between the two camps, on a morning I was driving it, there was a driver attacked by bandits and killed. So there's this kind of thing, but not active war in that sense. So in Sudan, I think the risk for journalists carrying cameras is the getting caught up in the conflict and people not knowing who you are, what you're doing, what your motives are. You're going to be suspected as a spy or an operative or a mercenary. So that would certainly be, whatever side you're on, and not just Western journalists and photographers. That would apply to Sudanese photographers and journalists as well, who have been at extreme risk, and many of whom have fled the country as well. So I think we're kind of winding down here now. We've had an hour of conversation. I'll just double check that there aren't any other questions that I've missed. I think I've got to them all. I'm very sorry if there was a question that you put through and that we weren't able to get to. But Nicolò, were there any final thoughts you wanted to share before we sign off? You're heading back in the near future.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if or when I'll go back, but certainly I'm following the story with great interest.
Yeah, of course. Likewise.
Yeah.
I saw. I don't know if we have time. There was a question: are you both always on assignment to cover these humanitarian catastrophes, or have you had to self-finance these undertakings? Well, I, in general, work mixing a bit of both. Either if I'm on my own somewhere, I will reach out to editors and clients to let them know that I'm there and pitching stories or coverages. And when I'm on assignment, as it happened this time, I just decide to overstay when I see that there's a lot to say. And again, it's true that there has been little interest compared to the level of disaster, that the Sudanese people are facing. But I think that, as continuing to return to this place as messengers, communicators, photographers is also a way to respond in a form of protest, against that kind of indifference. Because then we go back, even if there's lack interest in the work grows, and it becomes always more difficult to ignore it, so also to ignore a story. And we just need to be patient because, of course, also the editorial agenda is not following our assignments agenda or our working schedule. So
Yeah.
to me, it's all about continuing to explore a situation until I'm not an expert yet of this situation. But in general, my approach of photography is to explore something until it becomes part of me, so that I can really relate to it and understand it. And to that point, when photography also grows, it becomes more natural to find diversity also into the platforms that eventually will host the work.
Yeah.
So a grain of sand at the time, a little brick at the time.
Yeah. And for me as well, I was also commissioned to go there. I didn't go on an editorial assignment for a media agency. I actually was commissioned by an organization called Avaaz, which is an advocacy organization that covers human rights and conflict and climate change around the world. And so they sent me there. They paid my expenses and my rates to cover the story, and then I helped them place the work that I produced from there in the Washington Post and in CNN and other outlets, The Guardian in the UK, and Here Tonight.
Yeah, exactly.
And I've put the links. I put some links to those stories. I put a free link to the Washington Post story as well as the CNN story that I did, interactive story that I did for them. Maybe Nicolò, could you put in your link to your time story as well?
Yeah. I also have other publications, but like I
Yeah,
was not so broad them here. This
yeah,
is Zeit.
yeah.
They did several publications, and they pick one photo at a time.
Right,
And
right.
but I will share time because this is in German, and I'm not sure that it's under a paywall probably at the
Okay,
online
okay,
version. Yeah.
okay. Well, I mean,
But
people can go on your Instagram account if they want to see
yeah,
links
exactly,
to the time story, and
exactly.
I think we'll wrap it up there. So thank you to everybody who joined us, and Nicolò, thank you so much for sharing your insights into how you covered this story and some of the details of the story, because we're two photographers here talking about our work, but ultimately this conversation needs to be focused on the people who are affected, the
Of course.
in Darfur, or in Eastern Chad, from Darfur, and their stories. So I hope that that people got some insight into their situation, and how they're coping, how they're living, and the challenges that they are facing.
It's important that we continue to talk about the conflicts and the injustices that are going on. Like even in this scenario, like even events like this, like we don't have enough time to go into details of. And every time I try to study a little bit more about the conflict in Sudan, it becomes more complicated, more intricate. Like alliances that become enemies, and the other way around, and it's very subtle and layered. But in response to the like also of this shadowing process of like communicators, journalists everywhere in the conflicts, I think one of the response that we can use and have is just continuing to do our job and continue to talk about these conflicts, because like then like people can be inspired to go and check and look for more information. And it's all about that also photography, like leave something that then can inspire and lead to a more in-depth study of reality, society.
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you so much
Thank
again,
you,
and thank
Finbarr.
you joined. And we look forward to seeing your next series of images from Eastern Chad. And we hope that at some point
Likewise.
this will all end, and that the people we photographed can go home and live more peacefully. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you,
Nicolò,
Finbarr.
if you want to stay on for a second while everybody else goes,
Of course.
we'll just wrap up the two of us. But thank you to everybody else. We'll end it there. So rather than me closing this down, if you don't mind, please logging off and we'll end it. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.